thank Susan Hall-Dotson. She's the coordinator for African American history here at the Indiana Historical Society. And at this point, Susan, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here today. Oh, you're unmuted. You're muted.
Hello?
Yep, perfect.
All right. It's not where I want to be, but we'll figure this out. All right, there we go. Every time it's a different thing. But at any rate, hello, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I am Susan Hall-Dotson, as Jeanette said, and I'm the coordinator of African American history. So I do all things African American history all day, every day. And let me get this straight so we can get back to business. I'd really love to hear any questions you have even before I start. So as we're going, I can figure out like what you really want to know, what you really need help with, and not just me babbling. We've had discussions about what we think this should be about. So, and I have a list of most of the counties that you represent. And so I try to pluck a few things, not a lot, but a few things from said places, because what many of you don't know, I am new to Indiana. I have been here literally 3 years, June 1st. I knew very little about Indiana history. I knew about the Jackson 5. I knew about Mayor Hatcher. I knew about the Colts. Let's see what else. The Pacers, Reggie Miller, his sister Cheryl. Not a whole lot more. So all of this in a short period of time, I have been digging and searching and reading and learning more stuff and getting new collections in addition to learning about the existing collections. And many of the collections that we have obviously impact the work that you do. And the work that you do impacts the work that we do as well in telling stories. I come to this as a historian, an archivist, and most of all, a curator. My passion is to how do we get the collections, how do we take the stories and then get them out of the boxes and into documentaries, books, or exhibits. So I'm not just about being a librarian and where they are on the shelf and being able to locate them, but be able to use them and to contextualize the histories and the stories. And none of it is easy. None of it is just as simple. Go to the box, it's there. And I'm going to pull up this PowerPoint, and maybe this will help start our conversation a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to go back to the title page, Black History is American History. So as much as we like to separate them out, I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this?
It's not shared yet, Susan.
Okay, let's see. Let's share it. Let's do that. Share.
Yep, I can see it now.
Okay. All right, there we go. Now we got big screen. So that's a big misnomer. You know, yes, I deal with Black history every day, but Black history in America is American history. It's hard to separate the two, and we like to make things in little boxes and compartmentalize them. But usually there's not this big separation, so to speak. So I'm one for saying it's also not just in February, even though I recognize Carter G. Woodson, who's preeminent historian of his time, started Black History Week. And the reason why it was in February was, on the one hand, President Lincoln's birthday and Frederick Douglass' birthday were both in February. There you go. No other nefarious reason, the shortest month of the year and all those other things you may have heard. But Black history is 365, all day, every day. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Oops, back up. From Marcus Garvey, and a people without the knowledge of their roots and past history, it's like a tree without roots. You have to know. We all need to know. We all want to know. Even if we say we don't like social studies, we don't like history, the past affects the future, and the present. Some things we shouldn't repeat at all, but here we are. How do we learn from that? And one of my other favorite African parables, until the lion tells their story of the hunt, their story will always glorify the hunter. So it's important that Black voices, Black oral histories, Black narratives are available, and that the histories that we're telling are not just from others outside. And some of my favorite books that I use for research, for example, written by Emmylou Thornburg, great book, great piece of history, great piece of research. But as you read it, you see it's written from the perspective of Black people being a subject. There are different nuances for those who write history if they are of said communities, and you'll see a different agency and voice being brought to the forefront. And this just gives you a citation of where that parable, that proverb, African proverb, comes from. And that applies to everybody. Everybody deserves to tell their stories. Everybody deserves to have a voice. And one of my other favorite people to quote is Bryan Stevenson. Some of the stories that we're going to look at, and some of the stories that you're working on, and the stories from your counties and your communities they're hard, they're dark, they're troublesome, and people get in their feelings, as we say nowadays, and want to self-protect because it wasn't me, I didn't have anything to do with it, and maybe it was my ancestors, and maybe it wasn't. You can't change what happened. We can only just learn from it to go forward. So running from telling it, even if it's sad, bad, vile, it just is what it is. And how we interpret that, it's not about atonement, it's not about forgiveness, it's not about blame. It's just about, this is what occurred in said space, and let's look at that. And we can maybe go deeper into the why. Why did that happen? And if it was something that was very nefarious and vile or violent, how do we not repeat that possibly in the future? But, and it's important to, and if we want to have some sort of reconciliation, we need to have truth. So running away from it can be awfully problematic. So the best place to start telling Indiana stories of Black history is to also look at the nation. And here, just as you see on the screen, are numerous notable figures in American history, Black history. In the upper left-hand corner, Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X. Then you have Thurgood Marshall, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass has a connection to coming to Indiana and Pendleton. W.E.B. Du Bois, Harriet Tubman, the first Black senators and congressmen on the lower left-hand corner, post-emancipation during the Reconstruction era. And it goes on and on. And the more you know about a global context of the country's history, that will help you to find the answers and understand what it is you're looking at. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders, in the picture right below him in the center is the Niagara movement, which founded the NAACP. Then became known as the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. And it was a mixed race organization. Ida B. Wells was also one of the members, of the founding members of the NAACP. And knowing about who they are, where they came from, and how they intersect throughout the country, we have this thought sometimes in our mind in the Wayback Machine that people didn't move around, but they did. They moved around a lot. Some of these stories that I'm getting ready to share in a second.
Susan, we had a question in the chat
Yeah,
from a
cool.
museum, and it says, referring to sort of how the stories should be told by the people who live them. And it says, yes, are we doing a disservice to our researchers and community by having quote unquote Black history files in our vertical files? In the past, so little of these stories have been woven into our overall narratives that it feels like we need to highlight them, but it also feels wrong somehow, like it's being put in a box. She said they feel the same way with their women's history files.
Well, I think it's not an all or nothing situation, where on the one hand, we need to have Black history, where you can go to it, look at it, feel it, touch it, talk about it as Black history. At the same time, so it's not an all or nothing proposition, we need to also filter that in so that it's not separate and apart always from majority history, white history, American history. We can talk about American history all day and not talk about slavery. Or we talk about, well, there were slaves in Indiana, and then there were no slaves, and then there were this, and not talk about anything else about them. I think that's disingenuous. So we do get both. Women's history, I just pointed out and highlighted a couple of women on the previous slide. I'll go back. That oftentimes don't get their due until we're talking about Women's History Month. But the things that Ida B. Wells, for example, was doing wasn't just for and about women. Anti-lynching campaign. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was a journalist. She was traveling across this country and a writer. And that speaks volumes as a woman, as a Black woman, but also what? An American woman. So I don't know that we always need to extract them out. So it's three pots, maybe, of stories. And how do we manage that? And not to demean by being separate. It's okay for me to be able to pull up a file and say, here goes Black stories. But then to also recognize how they interact, filter, and are enmeshed in American stories, or national, international stories for that matter. Harriet Tubman did what many men didn't do. And yes, these men on the bottom there were only Black congressmen during Reconstruction. And you don't get to women in, say, the Senate. Here goes the first Black woman in Congress, Shirley Chisholm, out of Brooklyn, New York. And let's see, do I have a picture of her? She's not in here, but Carol Moseley Braun was the first Black woman in the Senate. And we can still count how many women in the Senate and women in the House, Black, white, Asian, Native American, or others. So how do we tell those stories? Separate and apart. Let's see. So here we are, this lovely map of Indiana, and I've been all over. I have had the pleasure of going into Gary and Munster Hammond, Chicago. So far, I have been all the way down to Lyle Station. I've been to New Albany. So in a short period of time, I've been able to get around the state, and I live in Marion, but I also live in Delaware. My husband teaches at Ball State University, and instead of both of us having this big commute every day, or one having it, one not having it, we have two houses, and we kind of go back and forth. So I get to go there too. I've been all the way over here along this border, Union, Dark County, Ohio borders on that side as well. So a lot more places to go. So if you want to host me to come, I want to come and visit too. I need to learn more. And we're always looking. Everybody thinks all we talk about is Indianapolis. And that's not true. We try to talk about more, but we need your help. So I went in and did a little dig. And I think one of the ways to do Black history in Indiana is to go backwards to come forward, and then forward sometimes will make you go backwards. So we have a vast collection about the early settlements. Many of you may have seen it. You can actually find a lot of it digitized online, and it does bring it up by county. So I picked a county that I hadn't been to, Blackford County. And in here, it talks about, this is a bibliography that was created by Georgia Cravey. I think I got my slides out of order on this one, but there were 0 early Black settlements in Blackford County. But here it talks about who was there. So sometimes to get to Black stories in the early days of Indiana, you have to deal with the white population. That's why I say it's not a zero-sum game. And I pulled some documents yesterday from a book about Vincennes before it was actually a state, and it was talking about the slaves. And it didn't name any of them, but it did name who owned them. So go back to what you can find to find out from deeds and records, and then maybe going forward, did they stay, did they go? And so it talks about how small of a population it was. That at one point, there were only, in 1840, there were 13 Blacks in the state, in the county. And so then that'll give you more reason to go find out, where did they go? Who came after them? And use all the tools that are available to you to go forward and backwards. And maybe there isn't this deep, rich story like another county, but maybe you'll find where those individuals went. And here goes Jim Madison's current book about the Klan in the 1920s. At the very bottom, it says the 1920s, the Klan established a chapter in this county. And that was one of the reasons why that there weren't that many African Americans maybe left in the county. Does it make us feel good? Absolutely not. But it is what it is. And that will help you figure out who was where. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So I pulled Hamilton County, has one of the biggest early settlements, Robert's Settlement. And we have lots of information about Robert's Settlement, and there are books written about it, at least one book that's primarily about Beach and Robert's Settlement. And I just got, and I'm having a happy dance, new collection of photographs from Robert's Settlement and Noblesville. Some as tintypes, some as early as the early 1800s. And I'm getting that from descendants who are keeping their story. So that's the place, one of the places to start. Who is still left? Who is nearby? Who can help you tell those stories? So there are bibliographies on our site about Robert Settlement, which at some point maybe that was based on that thing, but there's some newer items that I can help provide. But so then I went down south, Vanderburgh County, and there was one. And there are lots. What was amazing to see in the number of African Americans went from 3 to over 2,000 in 1870. That's tremendous. Why was that? End of slavery, emancipation, Juneteenth, as we just celebrated, and people being able to have freedom of movement, and to be able to then understand the why, the what happened, say on a national level, helps you understand why this influx all of a sudden. Then you can look at where did they come from? Was it just from Ohio? Was it from St. Louis? Was it from North Carolina? And then look at some of the businesses and the church records that help you tell those stories. But getting a sense of what was, even if it's still not there, will help you to figure out what happened in the middle. So here goes the bibliography that's on our website about where they found that information and how Wilma Gibbs Moore, my predecessor, late predecessor, and Georgia Cravey and Donna Stokes Lucas and others, what they did for the early settlements. And there's still more to learn. Now, this is something brand spanking new. I got a call from, or an email from a gentleman. He sent me this photograph and said, "Would you like it?" And I was like, "Sure." Didn't know anything about it except for what's written on the front and what's written on the back. And the man right here in the spotted vest, that is the world heavyweight champion, Joe Louis. This is the man's great uncle. So we took the photo. I asked him a bunch of questions. He didn't know much of anything about his own uncle. I think he's white. I'm not sure 100%. He could also be light as well, light-skinned African American, but we will find out. And here goes his bodyguard. I dislike when people write on photographs, but I'm also thankful when people write on photographs, because otherwise we wouldn't know what's going on here. But it's not him in the ring. He's in Jasper. It says he's in Jasper, Indiana, in Du Bois County, circa 1939. The back of the photograph. Luckily, there was some more information, and it was a hunting trip. And his uncle's name is actually Arthur. So Red, as it was on the front, was a nickname, Carnes. And we found out that Joe Louis had a training ranch at West Baden, Indiana. I don't know if it's his yet. We haven't gone that far. But I did ask the man who donated this, his name is Mark Edwards, just a list of some basic questions. What was his full legal name? Where was he born? Where did he die? And my colleague, Eric Mundell, and I stopped what we were doing, and we started going down the history rabbit hole and death records and other records. And so as I sent this to the donor, who said he didn't know much about his great uncle, he said, "I have one aunt who's still living. She might know." And she didn't know much either, but he found some information. So these are the answers that he was able to provide to me about the one gentleman whose collection or family photos it came from. But then he started looking too. I got him inspired, and he found this article in newspapers.com, and it's from 1946. And then it goes on to talk about Nanny Waddy in the article in the Waddy Hotel. And so then we started doing some more research slowly. I have to get back at it. But how to pick and choose and use all the tools and get as much from the people that you talk to as you can. And the fact that he died he didn't live and spend his whole life in one place. He was in Ellettsville. He's buried in Greenwood Cemetery. And there's something else, I can't see it because of our pictures on the side. He didn't know where he went to school. At the end, we found out he was a reverend. We found a little obituary. So how do we tell the story, not just of Joe Louis? Joe Louis is a famous individual, and we'll get back to him at some point and see where he was in the state of Indiana and what we can learn about the Wadi Hotel, since Blacks couldn't stay at the other hotels in French Lick at the time. So my best and most useful advice I give to myself on a regular basis is to go back to come forward. And sometimes you got to start in the forward and go back. Search the newspapers, obituaries, court records. All these things I know you already know, oral histories. But one of the things I find most important is to join your local organizations, genealogy clubs, NAACP, Urban League, book clubs, and create relationships with the Black community so that the willingness to share, the willingness to make deposits of stories and papers to whether it's your institution or ours, I think is helpful. People talk to people that they know, and that has nothing to do with race. People talk to people that they feel comfortable with. People share with people that they feel comfortable with and they feel are genuinely interested in telling their stories and sharing their stories. Another thing is to look at your local landmarks and utilize Indiana landmarks or national registries if they're there to learn more about a site in a place as well. So I think that's a big part of it too. And I'm going to use one of our, like Madam Walker collection. We are very fortunate to have over 10,000 items from her collection. And her great-great-granddaughter has done a great service by writing a couple of books about her. The most known one, On Her Own Ground. It has footnotes and all kind of things. But how she and we learn not just about Madam Walker, but she wrote this letter to Mr. Ransom. You could take a letter like this that you find in another collection. Who was that letter written to? Who are they? Not just maybe the collection of whom you received it from, and start doing more work on telling the story of the people in the community. And Mr. Ransom, too, has left us a cavalcade of documents and items and family history from his family, but that too tells the story of the broader community in Indianapolis. Same thing with this letter that is national in scope. It was a letter that Madam Walker signed along with 15 other people. It's an anti-lynching legislation push, and it went to President Woodrow Wilson, and it came on the back end of the 1917 race massacre in East St. Louis. And the pictures that you see here, Madam Walker was on the committee to plan this protest march. Madam Walker also funded this protest march, and in the collection is a receipt of such, of the, I think it was $200 that she gave. But these pictures are from New York City, and it was called the Silent Protest. And it was about 10,000 people marched down Fifth Avenue in silence. The only thing you could hear was the bang of the drums. And there were little children in front of the women. They were all dressed in white. The men, as you see, were all dressed in hats and top coats and ties, very formal. And except for the placards that they carried, all you could hear were the drums. So this is national in scale, it's New York in scale, it's East St. Louis, it's Madam Walker. By then, she wasn't living in Indianapolis, but her company was still here. How do you tell her whole life story if you don't look beyond, I call it the boot boundaries of Indiana, especially these border cities? You need to look into Ohio, Louisville, etc., Illinois, and people are coming from all over. And even the history on the building of her that bears her name, she didn't actually build it, but there's a story behind why it occurred. And we have some of those documents too. We don't know what the dispensation was, but she went to a theater for her, that was her fun, her respite, to go to the movies, the silence. And they charged her 25 cents. Somebody has called it the black tax, but she knew it had been 10 cents. She'd been there many a day. And this one time they said, no, for you today it's 25 cents for colored people. And she vowed to build her own theater, her own building where everybody could go and not be discriminated against. Black and white. Sadly, she died in 1919, but she had bought this parcel of land, which was right next door, right back here where this cursor is moving, if you could see it, was her home and her factory on West Street, going out that way and back behind there. And her daughter did what her mother's wishes were and built this Flatiron building that had a theater and offices and a ballroom, etc. And it's rather grand on the inside, and it's just received a $15 million renovation. And here it still stands, but there is a story behind that. And we have a copy of the lawsuit that F.B. Ransom, who I showed in the other letter, filed on her behalf. And we don't have a copy, or have not been able to find what the dispensation was legally on that matter, but we do know what the dispensation was, that she made a difference with her own money to build this building that still stands today. So some more favorite quotes for me. The more you know of your history, the more liberated you are. Maya Angelou. And I can't see my own stuff right now, but I'm sure you can. But knowledge is power, and that fist could be any color. It's all about the more we know, the better we are as storytellers, as historians, as county historians, as national historians, as librarians, that we get to share the stories and tell the stories. So I'm gonna stop share.
Susan,
now I can see your faces.
There was a question in the chat. Any progress getting records of the Black schools in Indianapolis?
Which Black schools?
I'm not sure who asked, so I will leave it to that person to either post in the chat and I'll share it, or feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Help me help you. Nobody's claiming their question.
It's actually Jan Vertrush. She is with Historic Eleutherian, which is in southern Indiana.
She said all of them.
Okay. Well, and what constitutes a Black school? That would be helpful too. Well, Indianapolis schools, the records are around and they're just not all in one place. IPS schools, a lot of their records are at the Central Library. many of them are actually digitized. So they are the holder of the majority of them. We have some, there may be some at IUPUI, I'm not sure. As far as the Lutheran, they have some. I don't know how many we have, to be honest with you, but they have an archives too. And we have a few pieces, and people are holding on to their things. So I know many of you may have met or heard of Roan Smothers, like with the Union Literary. Like he just recently passed away. Who is holding the things that he collected? I'm not sure. But there's a video. I just got, or I haven't received it yet, but I just saw a picture of a colored school in Patoka Colored School. I know that there's a move to have it listed as Indiana landmark, maybe even a national landmark, and I'm working not as diligently as maybe I should have, but I have to follow up to see if I can, see if we can get a copy of the photograph or license to use it. I'm not sure who has it exactly. So that, you know, I still back to this Black schools in Indianapolis. A lot, what does that mean besides the Color School for the Blind? There's Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks has their own museum and has a lot of things. We have some things, and people still have things. My mother-in-law graduated in 1950. Stanley Warren's book, which is out of print, has great photographs. We have a copy of it in the collection. Sadly, at the public library, people have taken their book, cut out pages to have their own photographs from when they were attending there. There's a new book coming out by David Williams, hopefully before the end of the year, but maybe in, I think he said the latest February of next year, which is about African Americans in Indianapolis. And a big part of that does speak to school system.
Great.
And let's see, what constitutes a Black settlement? I think from what I have read, what we consider a Black settlement, it could be one family. So one had one family and others had maybe 5 to start. And many grew and many receded over time or moved. Like the Roberts settlement family actually first came in at Beach Settlement, which is a different county, and then moved and bought the parcel of land, as it says in the slides, and moved to where Roberts Settlement is now. Lyle Station, there's still some families that still live there. Then Stanley Madison is running the museum there. They just unveiled, I think, some statue there recently, like last week. We have some of the things. I'm working on getting some images from my mother-in-law, who is a descendant of Lyle Station. And her father, who came from Kentucky. So we could take it, the story doesn't always begin and end with Indiana, just like Madam Walker. She was born in Mississippi, moved in Louisiana, moved to Vicksburg, Mississippi, moved to St. Louis, then to Pittsburgh, before she even came to Indiana in 1910. But she had her greatest success in her business from 1910 to 1960 when she was in Indianapolis. And then she moved to New York and built this massive mansion, Villa Lawaru, which still stands today. And sadly, she died in New York. So the forward and backward story, is all over the place. And of course not. I've been to Weaver when I was in Marion. I went to Weaver and I got to meet some of the descendants, Pettigrews and others from Weaver settlement. And so there are numerous ones, and the stories are still emerging, and and you too can still help to gather the stories about the people who lived there then and where they went to. So that's where it goes into the future. For example, you're talking about Black schools in Indianapolis. Matthias Noel-Cox from Lyle Station became the first principal of Crispus Attucks High School. So his story is not singular in Lyle Station or Indianapolis. And so my mother-in-law would have been his niece.
Susan,
Yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
It is, so you've talked about people holding on to pictures and people holding on to sort of those objects that represent history.
Yes.
So my question has to do with how you start a conversation with people if you are part of a local historical organization and you're interested in learning more, collecting more, and sharing more stories of, of Black communities. How do you start that conversation? And what are some of the barriers a local historical organization may face in collecting sort of a more diverse history than they have been?
I would say the obstacles, people have to feel comfortable with you personally or your institution secondly. And most lay people, honestly, don't understand what we do. So if you have the ability to invite them to the library, to the museum, or somewhere else, or a virtual tour, even of IHS collections, people don't necessarily understand what you're doing with their things and why you would want them. So you got two kind of people out here. You got the people who don't care about the stuff that they have. So we're always running the risk of that stuff getting thrown away somewhere along the way because it's oftentimes in their way. And on the other hand, you have people that are holding on to them because they're mightily precious to them and they don't want to lose them. And so it's about education. So relationships and education, how to build a relationship where people feel comfortable with sharing their stories, sharing their treasures, and parting with their treasures, be it permanently or temporarily, as what we do with some collections is we do loan to scan, which is relatively new in the industry. There was a time we didn't do that. Aside from the technology that just didn't do that. It's very time consuming and laborious to take it in and then organize it and scan it and then give it back. And then the agreement is that we have license to share that. So I'd say relationship building is really key. Now sometimes, and people need to know what you do. They have to understand what that is. So the man that just sent me that Joe Louis photograph, here's his story. His father died a number of years ago. He saw the picture in the box amongst his father's belongings. And at that moment, he really wasn't ready to deal with what to do with his father's things. And he put the box to the side. And he said, I was going through this box again, and I came across the picture, and I said, So he reached out to us. We didn't reach out to him, but he knew who we were in order to do that. And he just sent me a picture of the image and said, do you want it? I was like, sure, but wait a minute. Who's your, so I had to also, so he was ready to relinquish that. But I also needed him to relinquish it with more information or the best that he could give me. So I would gingerly was like, certainly would love to have this in our collection. It fits in our scope because it was taken in, in Jasper, Indiana. But could you tell me more about your great uncle? Because what's important to me is not just about Joe Louis. It's the other people who are in the photograph. And, you know, back and forth. And finally I talked to him on the phone, and I did make it kind of fun. I was like, welcome to going in my emails with him when I sent the questions. Welcome to going down the rabbit hole with us, because that's what we do. We need to find out more about when, where, who's in the photograph. And so he's been corresponding with me and talking to his aunt that I don't know when the last time he talked to her, but he took the time to do that and then found that newspaper article. I hadn't even gone that far yet. But what was his uncle's legal name changed some of our search when we found out his obituary and marriage and his wife's family from Martinsville. So you got Ellettsville, you got Martinsville, you got Jasper, you got West Baden. So their story is like this. It's like a spider web. It's not just one place. So I think that's the long short answer of how to get to people, and maybe to show them what you do with it once you've retrieved it. People have to trust that. And that's not just Black folks, just trust that you're sharing their story for the right reasons. And not just Black History Month. Okay, I will say this as on a more personal note. Don't wait till February 2nd to call somebody and ask them for something for Black History Month. That's like Christmas. It comes every year at the same time. So maybe you should have started that relationship building and question answering and gathering in October, in March, build it for a whole year round. That is the most, I don't know, it's the same thing for, somebody calling you the day after your birthday. Why? And they knew it was there. They knew it was coming. They just forgot. Somebody's laughing. I see it. Yeah. And MLK Day, now Juneteenth. I just did 2 talks last week, and we could talk about that at another day. But Juneteenth has everything and nothing to do with Indiana. And, but now we'll see what that means as far as recognition and remembrances and celebrations. It's exhausting. So we don't do that. Don't be that person. And it has nothing to do about being white or Black. Just don't be that person who waits to ask somebody in February to talk about Black people in February. And when people are, and those of you who have space and place, it's important that people see the space. We do tours of the stacks. I show them conservation, so they can see where we put them. Now they don't want to come see my office where it comes to before it gets there, because it's stacks of stuff. But we try our best to be good stewards of people's family, business, stories, history, treasures. Even the family that is giving it away because they don't know what to do with it. Don't really, those are old pictures, it doesn't matter. But those are the people you need to get to first, because they'll throw it in the trash. I mean, I have cried a river over some dumpstered stuff. And once it's there, you can't get it back. It's done for. And sometimes you have to wait. You have to wait on people to be able to give you those things. They don't happen right away. I've been here 3 years, and the Robert Settlement photographs is a relationship that I have been courting, I guess, and not necessarily to get the things, but I am happy they were ready to give up things. How many of you have seen the new Traces magazine? Have you seen that yet? With the gentleman sitting at the piano, Belford Hendricks. I'll tell you a story about that. His great niece is Rebecca Bibb. So for those of you who live in Anderson area and read the Herald Bulletin, she's a writer for that newspaper. I have met her. She has interviewed me. I've been quoted a couple different times in articles, and she's told me stories about her family, and she's going to give us her stuff. Well, I didn't have the stuff, but I got a phone call from another museum looking for a photograph of the man, Belford Hendricks, and his nickname is Sinky, and none of us now know why, but we do know that much. And I looked in our collection to see if it came up somewhere else, and it did not. So I called her and I said, hey, they're looking for a picture of your great uncle. She goes, yeah, they called my dad. I think my dad is going to give him one. She goes, I guess now's a good time for me to give you the stuff I've been telling you I had. 15 new images showed up. I was off that day. It was right before Christmas, but I went in so we could transfer this, COVID and all. And she had already written the article for Traces, but we didn't have any of the images in our collection. And I don't know why that hadn't transferred from her to them, at least for this article. But I got to call upstairs and say, no, they're coming. So not only are they in the article, I'm almost finished processing, so they'll be available. We digitized them for the article, so that'll also be a digital collection as well. But this is a conversation and a relationship that I've made over the last 3 years. And I listened to her. Listening. I talk a lot, but I listen too. Listening is key. So I knew about Belford. So I knew to call her and say, hey, you got that over there? And so she was ready. And she also has some more, lots of others. I think it's her great grandfather was a Negro League player, Junius Bibbs. So we've got pieces and parts of the ABCs and the clowns in Indianapolis, and soon we'll have some more stuff and story about Junius Bibb and then his family. And I'm gonna see if I can read some of this. I think that's what. Let's see. I found that the local African American community celebrated the study of the 15th Amendment. Yeah, I mean, those are the stories, Bill, that you just posted, that sometimes they come up in old newspapers, and sometimes I call them the angels in the archives or somewhere else. You just find the stuff, and you're looking for something else, and you're like, huh, who knew? Yes, Glenda, has there been an effort to collect stories? I don't know about oral history stories. I would say most of the players have passed. There are 2 Negro League museums in the country. One is in Kansas City and the other is in Birmingham. I don't know that we have stories, but we do have images, numerous images of players, and there's some documents, some letters, and there is a historian Jerry Strecker. She is like awesome, all in it, knows everything about it, right here in Indianapolis, Ball State too, that does that. And somebody just from Evansville just asked me about that the other day too. So, but that's a project out there for any of us to do, or to collab to do. But most who just died, he wasn't actually a Negro League player, but he was an early integration player, was Mudcat Grant just died. And there's a small museum in Cleveland too that deals with Negro League players.
Thank you, because we have one former Negro League player who's buried in our big major cemetery, and a local newspaper reporter carried that story. He figured out that George Shively didn't have a tombstone, and so they've done a lot of research, they've done a lot of work, and we now have a tombstone for him at least, and his family. But how else we tell his story is still not quite done.
Who did he play for?
I'd have to hunt for my notes to be able to tell you, but I'll send you some notes.
Yeah, I mean, it comes in sometimes the strangest ways. In Cleveland, I found a national grant to refurbish films. So there was a Black filmmaker, was also a social work teacher, but that was his business. He took photos and did creative films. And it was unprocessed, and I just digging through the stuff, and I picked 3 reels and I submitted them. And one of the reels that I submitted was 1945 Cleveland Buckeyes. And it was a short, maybe 10 minutes clip. And come to find out, it was probably from when they won the World Series. And they played the Birmingham Black Barons. And so that has now been remastered and cleaned and digitized. So you find it where you find them. But then sometimes you got to just go looking for it and say, well, where else did he work? And looking at the census, and where did he move? And maybe finding out more stories about who he really was, or his family. Let's see. Anything else anybody could think of?
I have another question. We did a cemetery tour over the weekend locally, and we were shown that there are a half a dozen graves for colored troops close to the Doughboy statue, but they were, I think, troops from the Civil War and maybe right after that. Are there lists, are there places to search for more information about those who served in the colored troops?
No.
Okay.
There are lists. We do have them. For the 28th, is it the 28th Regiment? Well, we'll put my info in the chat, and we'll work with Amy Vedra, because they're better at this than I am too. But we do have the muster list, if you will. I learned a new word recently. And this list has, if you know, and if you don't, you'll be doing like I did one day, up and down all these lists. But every unit in the 28th Regiment in Indianapolis, and it'll tell you if when they mustered in, why they mustered out, what year they came in, and where they were from. Some died in battle that may list that, or they were sick. It doesn't give you a whole lot of information, but what these lists do give you is where they were from, if you have their name, and what unit they were in. And everybody who was in the Indiana 28th Regiment did not come from Indiana. Just like the first soldiers from Indiana didn't fight under Indiana. They fought with Massachusetts because Indiana wouldn't take blacks to be soldiers in the Union Army. So we had this we followed him. His name is Milton Robinson. And he's mentioned in a book. And there was a photograph, and we were excited. And we drove to Crown Hill, and we found his burial site. But he was not with 28th. He was with Massachusetts, the one made famous by Glory. Yes, Bill?
They might want to check if your library has it. A lot of libraries have a big set of books called Terrell's, Terrell's, Terrell's Indiana in the Civil War. It was a report to the Adjutant General of Indiana, and they were apparently republished at some point along the line. So I know a lot of places wouldn't have the originals because it goes to several volumes. I know Ball State, the university libraries have them. I'm sure IUPUI, but the 28th is in there. And besides the roll, it has place of enlistment, place of discharge, but it also has the actions, that the regiment saw. They were in this battle, that battle. They were at Petersburg, for example. And it's really quite helpful because then what I did was I worked with the National Archives, and I have copies of the pension papers of every one of the black soldiers. Well, I can't say everyone because there's probably some out there I've missed, but you can write to the National Archives, and you want their pension papers. The discharges really don't tell you a whole lot. I mean, it's just a legal confirmation, but the pension papers go from the time they enlisted all the way to the time they died, some of which run into the 1915, 1916. Also, there are African-American soldiers, generally not from Grant County, but from other counties and other states, who are buried at the Marion National Cemetery, which is, some people will know it as the Marion VA. It's the National Military Hospital. And there are listings online actually, I believe, for all national cemeteries. Now, the problem is, I don't know that they're searchable by war. I think you have to know a name. But once you get that, it just sort of opens a whole bunch of doors. Also, just one quick thing is that you'll find also that there are some African-American soldiers that enlisted in white regiments. And I found that in pension papers, and it had to do, these guys that were, especially, most everybody was living in the country. I mean, Indiana was a rural state, and people enlisted in companies of neighbors. And so sometime, now it was a rare occasion, and I don't mean to say, because 98% of, I believe, all African-American soldiers in the Civil War were in U.S. colored troops. I mean, it was just absolutely the way it was. But some actually, and this needs to make for interesting stories, some served in white regiments. And, and their stories are interesting too. But there's a lot of Civil War stuff out there. But look at the pension papers instead of the enlistment, the certificate, which are nice and they're very pretty, but the pension papers will even have a description of the wounds and family relationships. For example, I found out some of these people moved to Kansas with the exodusters. And so, I mean, like you say, it's the rabbit hole. One thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So anyway, sorry, but that's okay. I feel really great about the Civil War guys. We got a replacement. The VA put a replacement tombstone in for one of our guys, Sergeant Thomas Pettiford, whose stone had sort of dissolved over the years. they brought a new one out and installed it themselves. It's quite nice. So anyways, Civil War.
Bill,
So
Donna
good.
asked in the chat if you could repeat the name of that source you mentioned earlier.
Okay, it's Terrell's Indiana in the Civil War. And I think it's sometimes listed as Report to the Adjutant General. So it was the official record of men in the Civil War from the state of Indiana. And it's done by, it's like, oh my gosh, it may be 15 volumes. It's a huge book because Indiana had, you know, one of the highest enlistment rates or participation rates in the Union Army by percentage of any state in the Union. So it's a massive set of tomes, but it's really nice. It's once you get the hang of it, it takes a little while to get used to how they're doing things, but really it's very well organized. I think an accountant did it. That's why it's so neatly done. But yeah, I know, like I say, Ball State, the universities have them. Our library had a copy of that. It's just a great thing to look at.
I think we have that, and that's where I was looking to verify. And that was not the pension records, but just the rolls. So I could, and company A through like L, M, N, O, P, I was going forever trying to find this man's name. And I found his company and all this other good stuff. So we do, I believe we have that.
Just a quick, I got to tell the story. The 28th Indiana was at Petersburg, which was a horrible, bloody mess. If you saw that movie, Cold Mountain, you saw scenes from Petersburg. It was at the end of the war. And for their heroism, they were given the honor of posting the guard on the Confederate Capitol building once the South surrendered. So the 28th Indiana was there with their bayonets fixed and all that, keeping Confederates out of their own capital. Anyways, Terrell's a good story. Good.
I know what I forgot. I was thinking, and also you had people who were fighting in the Confederate side, who were forced to fight on the Confederate side, who may have ended up in Indiana. So, and you may not find rolls on them necessarily, but Black people have been fighting wars from day one. So they're everywhere. And just being able to find it. And I have a question for Bill. You said that with the national cemeteries being all online, what about those who are not buried in the government's national cemetery, but say in the veterans portions of Crown Hill?
Well, that would be kind of tough. Now, what the other cemeteries, one of the great sources I found is I consult genealogists. Mm-hmm. I have friends that are genealogists, and some of those people, you think we're crazy, going down rabbit holes. That's their whole existence. They really focus. So I've gotten advice because genealogists keep really good track of cemeteries because that's their go-to place for stuff. And I just check with them and I check online. During the Depression, some WPA projects for various counties was they paid somebody 40 cents a day to do a profile on the cemeteries, where they just, and the thing since 1939 or whenever it was done, 36, some of that stuff has disappeared, like stones have been knocked down or I get in a rant about this, I'm sorry, but trustees don't always behave responsibly about maintaining, and especially African-American graves. I'll just be frank. They just, went right over them, or the farmer plowed them up or whatever. But I think you can get a good, even in a fairly rural county, even more rural than Grant County. I suspect there's a genealogist that can tell you exactly where the bodies are buried.
Yeah, and DNR.
Yeah, DNR. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the big things that they work on as well. So.
Well, and many of the historical societies have lists of
Right.
their cemeteries.
Mhm.
Monroe County has published a book about the cemeteries.
If you're interested in looking at a project that has to do with the restoration, research and restoration on a historic Black cemetery, a few years ago, the Heritage Support Grant Program helped fund one in Thorntown. It's the Thorntown Colored Cemetery Project. It started as an Eagle Scout project and then sort of bloomed into a cemetery preservation restoration project. That's a good one to look at in terms of the kind of research that went into it and then the kind of work that they did, because records showed a much smaller number of people who were buried there than what they actually were able to find using ground penetrating radar and things like that. And we can give you some contact information if you're interested in sort of finding out how they did that project and how they worked with folks, descendants of the folks in the cemetery, as well as other people who were knowledgeable about African American history in that area of Indiana.
Could I ask if various historical societies or county historians have done local history projects about Black history in your county? For example, we have, in addition to our various walking tours of this neighborhood or that neighborhood, we have a walking tour about women's history. We have a walking tour about Black history in Monroe County. And yes, on the one hand, that's segregating that history. On the other hand, it's making it available in one place for other people to learn and go from there and learn more. So are there other ideas and suggestions?
This is Jan down in Madison, and we've had a walking tour of the Underground Railroad history for probably a decade now. But just recently, a couple of us have been working on a walking tour of the Broadway community that was essentially the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, and has been pretty much paved over by the local hospital. And I moved here in '92. I remember them moving a house, but I had no clue that there was a huge community there for decades. So we're documenting that now, trying to just open people's eyes about what was right in the middle of our town. And as a historic town, rereading the newspaper articles and you know, just the shock that Madison wouldn't try to protect that part of the community as well. So yeah, it's interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Marion is fortunate to have a number of houses that were built by African American architect Samuel Plato. And so a few years back, what we did was a tour of the Plato homes. At least some we could get into and some not. But you know, we got a couple of buses. We had like 60 or 70 people, and it was very popular, and it brought a lot of attention to Samuel Plato's substantial contribution to African American life. And I want to return just a little bit to the cemetery. One of the earliest projects that, and now this is when I was teaching history at Marion High School. I got some students together, and we got with the Marion Public Library and a professional cemetery restorationist who, thank God, volunteered his time to help us organize the Weaver Cemetery Restoration Project. And we were able to restore it. When we started there, it hardly looked like a cemetery. It just looked like a grassy field. But by the end of it, a number of stones were set back up. There was some restoration work done under professional guidance. That tombstone for the Civil War soldier, like I said, was returned. But it was life-changing for the students, and it was life-changing for a number of folks, Weaver descendants. After a couple of days of working on it, we had people coming out and telling us stories. And, you know, I remember one woman being so grateful she finally found where her grandmother was buried, because after you lose those graves, then there's hardly any point of reference for these things. So cemetery projects are perfect for establishing good relations and getting people talking about their stories. But also, if you have any historic properties, for example, I found the place where a Tuskegee Airman, his family home in Marion. All right, and there's stuff like that around more than you think.
Mm-hmm.
So just keep looking, and if you find one, you'll find two. If you find two, you'll find four, because then that builds the trust that we're talking about, and people start coming forward. So, you know, I don't know why I never talked. You know, are you really interested in this? Yes, and that's I think the way you do it. And we have constant projects involving African American history, and I like to say every month is Black History Month, along with everything else, because it's a seamless part of the story.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you finally told us where you're from, Bill Munn. And now
Marion,
I know, because these little screen, my screen is only 13 inches anyway on my laptop. And I'm like, I remember you. And you took my husband and I on a tour of Weaver and downtown Marion, Olin Dawson, when we came for the EJI project.
You were a brand new director of African Americans.
And now it's all making sense. And I need you to send me an email with your number, because see, this is how it happens. Yesterday, I get a phone call. I'm not sure where this young lady is, but she called me about the Marshalls and the Weavers, and she's working on a book about, and her grandfather's sister worked for Samuel Plato. So all these things. So she called me yesterday. So I'm going to call her back this afternoon, and then I'm going to call you too, and we can all do this together. You know, I'm not all sure what she wants from us or what she has to give us, one or the other, or both.
She's a very smart lady. She'll have the questions, I'm sure.
Well, and just for the record, as Bill and I met way back 2.5 years ago, I have since been back to Marion, and I participated last summer in the soil collection for the Equal Justice Initiative. And I came back to do the soil transfer into the actual jar that's going to the lynching memorial in Montgomery that's sponsored by EJI. And I frequently talk to Tori Williams.
Former student and a great person. So
I have been to Marion now in a short period of time, maybe 5 times. I've even eaten dinner at the new barbecue restaurant. So it's very good. I can't overemphasize how finding like people, and some of the people in Marion I went to the big public forum about memorializing the lynching of Mr. Smith and Shipp, and some people were really for and against, but it's all, I learned a lot that day that even changed some of how I narrate the situation that happened there as well. And I've been to Montgomery. My husband's actually one of the architects on the companion building to the memorial, the library. and auditorium center. And so I've been there, I met with Brian Stevenson. So all of it kind of goes full circle. And that's just one story of Marion. It's often sometimes the biggest Black story that we hear. And then I have to remind people again, that's not Black history. That's American history.
It's Grant County history too.
Yeah, yes. There were thousands of people standing out there watching that, and there's photographs. And I actually, I had to fan myself, held one of the postcards, the original postcards that picture was made into. And
I like to think too that the work that the historian does also enables constructive conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and where people can differ, but do so politely. Actually, it's not different. It's not differing so much as everybody was raised differently.
That too.
It goes to the past. If we can get past some of those, and people. Well, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. But thank you for coming up. We enjoy it. But I think every place in India, my own hometown is Angola, and they've just dedicated that statue to was it Harriet Tubman? In their main Harriet Tubman spoke there from the courthouse steps. When I grew up in it many years ago, I never heard that. But now they've got a statue in the courthouse yard. It's amazing. It's just, I know we've got a long way to go, but I'm telling you, it's a lot different than it was.
Okay, Jenny, I see your question. I'm going to take a dive into that. So if you can send me an email to remind me, I will take a look, see what I know and who else I know, and see what we can come up with. And as I said, I was reading this old book about Vincennes that, it was brief, or in some of your own county history books, it doesn't name, most of the time doesn't name the Black people by name. It'll say, there was Negroes there and da-da-da-da. But it's a start, start there and move out. And then go look at census records, especially some of the smaller towns where there weren't that many people to begin with. So it just takes time, lots of time and lots of roadblocks, dead ends. And but that's why we do it. That's why all of us do what we do. So we could share and tell the stories in our community as well as regionally and nationally as well. So
Susan, Steve Barnett in Indianapolis here. One of the local individual, Samson Livingston, for the last couple of years, I guess, has been leading tours of the African American community. He has it's called Through Two Eyes.
Yes. And
he's a very entertaining historian, but he's done quite a lot in trying to let people know about not only the Indiana Avenue area, but also Brightwood, Indiana, Indiana, neighborhood in Indianapolis, even out in Irvington. And he's done quite a bit in trying to promote what has been lost, as well as what we still have in the way of the African American community in Indianapolis. One of the things, one of the things I've done is out in Irvington with the Irvington Historical Society, we have focused on Butler, which was in Irvington for a number of years, and the African Americans who were students at Butler. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not known, but having looked through the Indianapolis newspapers and all, you can find information about Black students who were attending, who may not have graduated, but at least attended Butler, and trying to compile a list of those. One of my early projects was on Gertrude Mahorny, who was the first African-American woman to graduate from a college in Indiana, graduated from Butler and Irvington. And her story is a little bit lacking finality because we don't know exactly what happened after she left Rockville, Indiana. She was a teacher at the colored school in Rockville for a few years, but left around 1915, and her whereabouts and subsequent activities are still to be found out. But appreciate all your efforts there at the Historical Society in capturing the history of the African American community, not only in Indianapolis, but also throughout the state of Indiana. And as Bill pointed out, we have our communities that, you know, growing up, even in Indianapolis, there are stories that I never heard of.
Mhm.
And it's fine. It's great to discover those stories and begin to share them with the larger public and to complete American history.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Now that you dropped that seed of Gertrude Mahoney, and it'll germinate somewhere. It may be 6 months, a year from now, and I'll be like, aha, look at that.
Yeah.
Maybe we find something. And so knowledge is power too. As I said, I literally got the cleanest slate ever.
Yeah.
And how I put it all together, it's like a Jenga thing some days. And I go, wow, who knew who that was or who that was? Of course, I knew who Joe Louis was.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a national figure, but I had no idea, nor did I care to know if he had a relationship. But now I know he did have a relationship to Indiana. So now I'm going to see, what did that look like and who else was involved in the moment that he was here. And everybody clearly that was involved in his time in West Baden and Jasper, they weren't all Black. So there we go. That's where you get the synergy and good, bad, or otherwise camaraderie of people who are working together or working against each other, but in the same space. And we get to tell that story.
Well, one of the other stories, my brother is well, he's retired now, but he's a photographer, commercial photographer, and he's been traveling with the new African American racing team, Indy Force.
Mhm.
And when they recently had a race at the Speedway in mid-May prior to the 500, they were talking about there was an African American mechanic. Speedway was, of course, segregated.
Mhm.
And there was an African American mechanic who would go in and work on one of the racing teams, the white racing teams back, I think, in the 30s. He'd go in after dark, work in the garage during the night, and leave before dawn. And stories like that are something that we try to bring out to show that there were African Americans that were participating, however, under the cover of darkness in racing. And of course you got the Golden Glory stories, and there are other things. I told him, I said, I think maybe the Speedway should maybe say atone for its past sins by maybe commemorating the Golden Glory someplace out there around the Speedway Museum. But there are all these little stories that, gosh, they're out there, and like you say, it's just listening and trying to ask the right questions and pulling out that thread and make a nice fabric of to complete our American history by the stories of these Black folks.
Well, what would be really helpful, I think, to all of us, including Jeanette and Tamara and Local History Services, as well as maybe your brother-in-law will give a picture of the current Indy Force.
Oh yeah.
So that it's in the archives now. generally, you know, we always think about how we collect stuff that's in the attic in the past, saving it from the barn and all the rest of that. And sometimes we have to collect in real time.
Yeah.
And
right,
not
that's
just
right.
wait till it's old and
Right.
dusty and add it to the collection. So if we do an exhibit, for example, which I'd love to do, I've had this conversation with exhibits about the Golden Glory, about Speedway, then we would have that, Willie T. Ribs, and then the current Indy Force, and we can have the image, or somebody's doing a History Day project, and they won't have to try to get that from the Indy Star,
Right.
you know, or somebody else to be able to use it.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. Today is tomorrow's history.
Exactly. So if you can help us make that
Yeah,
happen.
he'll be back
appreciate
in
that.
town in a few weeks, and I'll tell him to get some photographs and get in touch with you.
Great. That sounds great to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, great idea. Thanks.
And if you ever find out the name of the mechanic,
I think he does. I think
okay.
yeah, I think he does know that. So I'll.
So
press
that's
him
just
on that.
another rabbit hole.
Oh
just-
yeah, but you know, and gosh only knows what other stories are out there that this may lead to.
And you never know what we already have inside of something else, but we don't know to look for it,
Yeah.
you know. And I don't know everything that we have because I've only been there 3 years, as opposed to who I very much miss that I had the luxury of working with Wilma, who was there for 30.
Mhm.
So I talked to her, just so those of you who knew her, I'm like, oh, where is that box? Do you know where that is? And I sit and I commune with the ancestors in my office on a regular basis. So if you hear me talking to myself, sometimes I'm talking to myself and sometimes I'm actually talking to her or saying, I know it's here somewhere. Can you help a sister out? So just try to do the best we can and tell all our stories.
Great.
So I have actually appreciated all of you today, more than you know. I wasn't sure what to give, what you needed, but I think this worked out well. And thanks for your sharing. I'm tired of I've been doing a lot of Zoom presentations where I just talk and I show pictures and maybe there's a panel and we talk, but we don't get as much of our audience participation as we would like. And I miss that. So I'm glad to see other people's faces today and hear other people's voices besides my own in my own head. So thanks a lot for that. And so if you email me some of the stuff that I've been taking pictures of this because I didn't save it because I might not find it later, but I could look at these pictures and say, hey, that was somebody asked me a question. And we'll see what we could all do to work together. Absolutely.
Thank
It
you
takes-
so much. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you all for the great conversation. It's been really great to see you all today, and we really appreciate it. So yeah, it's been really good, and thank you. And if you've signed up for the presentation next week, you'll get the Zoom details for that on Monday. But otherwise, I will say, everybody, I hope you have a great weekend, and thank you for joining us today.